Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really significant topic, one that carries a lot of weight for many people: the historical context of Zionism and its impact.
That's right. We know many of you listening have asked for a clearer understanding of the complexities here.
Exactly, and that's what we're aiming for, digging into the sources you shared, pulling out the key details and the history.
And we've got quite a mix of materials, academic analyses, political discourse, personal stories, historical texts. It gives us a few different angles to look at this from.
So our mission, if you will, is pretty straightforward: understand the history of Zionism, its impact on the region, and that definitely includes the Palestinian experience, and look closely at some of the arguments and counter-arguments.
And crucially, we're sticking only to what's in these documents we have in front of us.
Yeah.
No outside opinions, just what the sources say.
Okay then, let's get started. Where's the best place to begin? Maybe the Palestinian refugee situation back in 1948? That feels pretty foundational.
I think so too. It's definitely a part of the history where the narrative has shifted quite a bit over time.
How so?
Well, for a long time, the sort of mainstream Israeli story was that Palestinians left in 48, mainly because Arab leaders told them to, right? To get out of the way of the Arab armies coming in.
Right, I think that's a version many people have heard, but you're saying recent history scholarship challenges that.
Very much so. Starting around the late 80s, Israeli historians Benny Morris is probably the most well-known, began digging into Israeli archives that were just becoming available.
The new historians.
Exactly. And what they found led to a drastically different conclusion. The view, now pretty widely accepted among scholars, is that 1948 involved the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians.
Ethnic cleansing, that's a very strong term.
It is. And, there's still discussion about level of premeditation. Was it a top-down plan from the start, or more something that developed amidst the chaos of war? But the general consensus on ethnic cleansing having occurred is quite established now in academia.
We have a quote here, I think, from Shlomo Ben-Ami. He was Israel's foreign minister, but also a historian. What did he say about this period?
Right, Ben-Ami. In his book, Scars of War, Wounds of Peace, he gives a pretty stark description. He talks about, let me find the exact words here, an Arab community in a state of terror facing a ruthless Israeli army whose path to victory was paved not only by its exploits against the regular Arab armies, but also by the intimidation and at times atrocities and massacres it perpetrated against the civilian Arab community.
Wow. That paints a very different picture than the leaving on orders narrative.
Completely different. You see how using these primary sources, these archives, led historians to fundamentally shift the understanding of how the Palestinian refugee crisis began.
And Ben-Ami, he didn't stop there, did he? What was his final conclusion based on his analysis?
He goes further, yes. He concludes that Israel did premeditatedly expel Palestinians. He connects it to what he calls the Zionist philosophy of transfer.
Philosophy of transfer, what does that mean exactly?
It's the idea, present in some strands of Zionist thinking apparently, that moving the Arab population out of Palestine was desirable or even necessary to create a Jewish majority state. Ben-Ami argues this thinking had deep roots and that it provided a kind of justification, maybe even encouragement, for commanders on the ground to push Palestinians out. He links it directly to Ben-Gurion's vision as well.
So a former Israeli foreign minister is essentially saying the expulsion was planned, rooted in ideology.
That's his conclusion, based on his research. It really highlights how interpretations of history, even by figures within the establishment, can evolve dramatically.
It certainly does. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. What about resolving the conflict today? We hear a lot about final status issues and the international view.
Right. The final status issues, those are the big ones everyone agrees need to be sorted out for a two-state solution. Generally, this means Israeli withdrawal from the territories occupied in 1967.
So the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem.
Correct. Then establishing an independent Palestinian state there. Mutual recognition, security guarantees for both sides, and, crucially, finding a resolution for the Palestinian refugees, including the right of return issue.
And is there much agreement internationally on this basic framework?
Overwhelmingly, yes. One of our sources points out, a bit wryly, that basically everyone except Israel and the US and maybe, quote, this or that South Pacific atoll supports this kind of two-state outcome.
So pretty strong global consensus.
Definitely. It's reflected in lots of UN General Assembly resolutions. There was one in December 2005, for instance, that laid out these principles clearly: withdrawal, Palestinian statehood, refugee solution, secure borders for all. They keep reaffirming that acquiring territory by war is inadmissible, and that Israeli settlements in the occupied territories are illegal.
Okay, so that's the broad international picture. Now, the sources also bring up quite a few criticisms of specific Israeli policies and actions. One point was about the 1967 war, which seemed counterintuitive.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
That was interesting. The usual justification for the 67 war is preemption, right? Israel striking first against an imminent Arab threat. But one analysis we looked at argues that using the 67 war as the prime example of legitimate preemption actually weakens the case for preemptive war overall.
How so?
The argument goes something like this. If that war, where the immediacy of the threat is still debated by historians, is your best example, then it lowers the bar too much. A true, justifiable preemptive strike, this view suggests, needs a much clearer, undeniable present danger, not just a potential or perceived one.
So holding it up as the model actually undermines the principle itself. Never thought of it that way.
It's a different angle, for sure.
Another really contentious policy mention is punitive house demolitions. Alan Dershowitz apparently made a comparison.
He did. Defending the policy, Dershowitz compared demolishing the homes of families of attackers to the Allies bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki. His point was that in war, sadly, innocent people suffer because of the actions of others, leaders, or individuals.
That's a very controversial comparison. Did other sources challenge that?
Oh, absolutely. Even the Israeli Supreme Court, while sometimes upholding the practice, acknowledged the harm to innocents. They compared it to, say, imprisoning a family's main breadwinner, but the kids suffer, even though they did nothing wrong.
Okay.
But Professor David Kretzmer, a legal scholar cited in the material, found that comparison weak. He draws a key distinction. Imprisonment targets the perpetrator directly. The family suffers as an indirect consequence.
Right.
With house demolitions, however, especially if the attacker is already dead or captured, Kretzmer argues the direct aim is to harm the family, to make them suffer as a deterrent to others. The intent is different.
And B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights group, they weighed in too.
Yes, B'Tselem stated that the express goal of punitive house demolitions is deterrence by making it clear that violence harms not just the person involved, but their whole family. So that supports Kretzmer's point about the intent being focused on the family.
The sources also mentioned the treatment of Palestinian minors in detention. That sounded quite concerning.
It did. Both Amnesty International and B'Tselem documented reports, particularly from after October 2000, alleging serious mistreatment. Things like dousing minors with freezing water, beatings, sleep deprivation, covering their heads with sacks during questioning.
Those are incredibly serious allegations, especially involving children.
Yes, very serious human rights concerns raised there.
There's also the specific case of Fawzi Al-Azmar mentioned. He was a Palestinian citizen of Israel.
Correct. A poet and writer, critical of Israeli policies. He was put in administrative detention back in 1969.
Administrative detention, that means held without charge or trial.
Exactly, based on secret evidence. He was held for 15 months, and even after release, confined to his town for another year.
And how does Dershowitz fit into this story?
Well, Dershowitz visited El-Azmar while he was detained. Afterwards, he wrote an article saying he was personally convinced El-Azmar led a terrorist group. Based on intelligence, the Israelis showed him intelligence, alleging El-Azmar headed an assassination squad.
But El-Azmar was never actually convicted of that.
No formal charges related to that, no. And later, Amnesty International actually campaigned for his release. So it raises questions, about the evidence Dershowitz saw and the whole basis for the detention.
The issue of torture also came up, related to a 1999 Israeli Supreme Court ruling.
Yes, in 1999, the court ruled against certain interrogation methods, basically prohibiting torture. Dershowitz mentions this, saying that before the ruling, Israeli methods were maybe similar to what the U.S. used against terror suspects. Physical pressure, but perhaps not outright torture in his view.
But was that definition challenged?
Yes. A U.S. judge, Jack Weinstein, in a different case, used a much broader definition of torture. He said it includes not just physical pain, but also psychological harm, threats, trickery causing despair. And importantly, Judge Weinstein cited U.S. State Department reports that, even after '99, described ongoing beatings and degrading treatment of detainees in Israel. That directly contradicted Dershowitz's claim that only fear, not physical pain, was involved post-ruling.
So, a real disagreement on what constitutes torture and what was actually happening.
A significant difference in definition and reported reality, yes.
Okay, another huge issue. The separation wall, or barrier, in the West Bank. We have conflicting legal opinions on that.
We do. It's a stark contrast. The International Court of Justice, the ICJ, gave an advisory opinion overwhelmingly saying the wall's route inside the West Bank violates international law.
Okay, the World Court says illegal.
But the Israeli High Court of Justice has repeatedly said the wall is legal. Their argument isn't so much about disagreeing on the law itself, but on the facts. They claim the ICJ didn't fully appreciate the security necessities that dictate the wall's specific winding route.
So they're saying you don't understand our security situation.
That's the essence of it, yes. They argue their rulings do align with international norms, but the ICJ just didn't have the right facts on the ground.
And does the Israeli High Court tend to accept the military's reasoning on security?
The sources suggest a strong pattern of deference, yes. Even when faced with counter-arguments from Israeli military experts, the court has largely sided with the state's security justification for the route.
There was also a point about proportionality and the Alpha Menashe enclave.
Right. The Israeli court uses a proportionality test. Does the security benefit outweigh the harm to Palestinians? But critics, according to our sources, question their reasoning, especially around Alpha Menashe.
Why there specifically?
Because that settlement enclave is right up against Israel. Petitioners argued the wall's route there actually let Palestinians from nearby villages cross into Israel without checkpoints, undermining the whole security argument. The court acknowledged this geographical reality, but kind of brushed off the argument, just stating the wall separates terrorists from Israelis, even though the facts seemed complicated.
Beyond the wall, there are broader movement restrictions mentioned too, right? Checkpoints, curfews?
Yes, Amnesty International details this extensively. A whole network of checkpoints, roadblocks, curfews that can lock down communities for days or weeks, and specific roads reserved only for Israelis, you can tell by the yellow license plates, while Palestinians with green plates are barred.
And in Gaza.
Gaza is even more restricted, especially since the blockade started in 2007 after Hamas took over. Severe limits on people and goods moving in or out.
And the enforcement of these restrictions. The sources mention violence.
Tragically, yes. Amnesty reported Israeli forces often using lethal force against unarmed Palestinians at checkpoints or during protests related to these restrictions, even when they pose no immediate threat. B'Tselem and Al-Haq also document house demolitions and ceilings used as collective punishment, separate from the punitive ones we discussed earlier.
It paints a grim picture of daily life under occupation.
The sources certainly convey significant hardship and danger resulting from these policies.
Okay, let's pivot to another major topic in the sources. The role of Israel affinity organizations, IAOs, in the U.S. sounds like a significant factor in the U.S.-Israel relationship.
Definitely. IAOs are basically U.S. nonprofits that support Israel. Together, they make up what people call the Israel Lobby.
And what kind of things do they do?
A whole range of activities. Organizing trips to Israel for politicians, journalists, community leaders, pressuring media outlets, running advocacy programs on college campuses, publishing reports, placing opinion pieces in newspapers, holding conferences, all aimed at promoting a positive image of Israel and influencing U.S. policy in its favor.
So quite influential. Does this influence go beyond just foreign policy?
Oh, yes. The sources say they impact news coverage, political campaigns through funding and endorsements, and even academia by funding chairs and programs, and the economy too, lobbying for those big aid packages and affecting how government money is spent.
One source argued this comes at a cost to U.S. taxpayers.
The argument presented is that the huge amount of aid and political capital directed towards Israel, pushed by these IAOs, is effectively paid for by American taxpayers, many of whom might not agree with those policies if they knew the full details or had a direct say. Think about the billions in annual aid, funding things like the Iron Dome system. It's framed as benefiting U.S. interests, but the source argues it's essentially a transfer of wealth driven by this lobby.
The structure sounds complex, too. Federations, JCRCs.
Yeah, there are different types. Federations are like umbrella groups. JCRC's Jewish Community Relations Councils work more at the local level. Then you have pure advocacy groups like AIPAC lobbying Washington directly, and others that mainly raise money to send to Israel.
Is the main goal always just supporting Israel?
For many, that seems to be the primary overriding focus. The source gives the example of the JCRC in Indianapolis, which apparently states very clearly on its website that it's pro-Israel, anti-Palestinian, and doesn't include Palestinian perspectives in its Israel-related programs.
That's quite explicit.
It illustrates a strong prioritization within some of these groups.
There are also some historical points, the ADL and the FBI.
Right. There's mention of a historical relationship. A 1942 FBI memo apparently noted the ADL saw itself as a key civilian intelligence partner for the Bureau, and it even shared a list of some 30,000 names from his files with the FBI.
Sharing names with the FBI. And what about Senate hearings in the 60s?
Those were hearings in 1963, looking into how the American Zionist Council, a major IAO at the time, was funded. Testimony revealed it got significant startup money from the Jewish Agency, which used funds raised outside the U.S. Senator Fulbright was grilling them because he knew they'd been told to register as a foreign agent, but they were resisting that label.
Interesting. And their tax-exempt status, has that been straightforward?
For a long time, yes. The IRS generally granted tax-exempt status. But the source mentions the Z Street case from 2010. Z Street sued the IRS, claiming their application was held up because their positions on Israel conflicted with official U.S. policy. The IRS seemed concerned their activities might cross the line for a tax-exempt charity. It suggested maybe the IRS was starting to look more closely after years of approvals.
And these groups are involved in education, too.
Quite significantly, according to the source. Education-focused IAOs apparently had revenues over $300 million back in 2012. They used this to influence school curricula, reading lists, programs like trips to Holocaust museums, all aiming to build empathy for Israel among young Americans.
The sources even touched on some older, more shadowy stuff. Nuclear materials, arms smuggling.
Yeah, almost like spy novel plots. The ENUMEC investigation in the 70s looked into whether nuclear material might have been diverted from a U.S. plant to Israel years earlier. CIA files showed denials of any involvement or knowledge. There was even speculation about whether President Johnson might have looked the other way.
Wow.
And before Israel was founded, there was a large-scale Haganah operation smuggling surplus WWII weapons and planes out of the U.S. to Palestine. People who later founded major Israeli companies, like Israel Aerospace Industries, were involved. Some lower-level guys got caught, but the main American financiers apparently didn't face prosecution.
Fascinating, complex history there. Finally, on the IAOs, what about their funding sources and this idea of shared values?
The analysis suggests major IAOs often get a large chunk of their money from a small number of very wealthy donors, giving those donors a lot of sway. And on the shared values claim often made about the U.S. and Israel, the source questions it, pointing out there aren't really comprehensive global surveys that include Israel to back it up. It also notes that anti-Semitism surveys done by IAOs often don't survey attitudes within Israel itself, hinting the results might not fit the narrative.
Okay, that covers the IAOs. Now, the sources also go into some very sensitive territory interpretations of the Talmud, specifically from a source called the Talmud Unmasked. We need to tread carefully here, just reporting what the source claims.
Absolutely. Extreme care is needed. This source, the Talmud Unmasked, presents a specific and highly controversial reading of the Talmud. The Talmud itself is, of course, a central text of Rabbinic Judaism, hugely important. The source notes some defenders compare its role to the Church Fathers for Christians.
And what specific claims does this source make about the Talmud's view of non-Jews, particularly Christians?
According to the Talmud Unmasked, some Talmudic passages supposedly referred to Jesus using codes like "that man" or "the carpenter's son." More inflammatory are claims that the text refers to Christians as idolaters, who should be, quote, wiped off the face of the earth, and equates them with the biblical Amalekites.
Wiped off the face of the earth. That's incredibly strong language attributed to the text.
Yes. The source also cites Kabbalistic texts, like the Zohar, claiming they identify Christians, seen as heirs to the Romans, as princes, who must be killed first for Jewish liberation. And it asserts the Talmud says Christians deny the law of the Torah.
It's vital we stress this is the interpretation presented in this specific source, the Talmud Unmasked, right? Religious texts are complex and often have many very different interpretations.
Critically important. This is one interpretation from one source, likely a highly contentious one, and it cannot be taken as representative of Jewish belief or Talmudic scholarship as a whole. We're merely reporting what this particular document alleges.
Understood. Okay, let's move back to historical chronology. The source, Palestine Speaks, lays out a timeline. Can we walk through the key points?
Sure. It starts late 19th, early 20th century. The Zionist movement is gaining steam in Europe. Jewish National Fund is buying land in Ottoman Palestine. Small Jewish colonies, Moshavot, are being set up. Population around 1900 is maybe 500, 600,000 total, mostly Muslim Arabs, smaller Christian Arab minority, and about 50,000 Jews.
Then World War I changes things.
Big time. You have the Hussein McMahon correspondence in 1915-16, where the British seem to promise Arab independence, likely including Palestine, if they revolt against the Ottomans.
But then comes the Balfour Declaration in 1917.
Exactly. Britain simultaneously promises support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, with caveats about protecting the rights of existing non-Jewish communities. A major point of contention, obviously.
Leading into the British Mandate period.
Right, formally starts in 1923. Tensions rise throughout this period between Zionist aspirations, Arab nationalism, and British rule. Then we jump to 1947, the UN partition plan proposing separate Jewish and Arab states.
Which the Arab League rejected.
They did, leading to the 1948 war. Israel declares independence, neighboring Arab states invade. The result: Israel wins, extends beyond the UN partition borders, and as we discussed earlier, over 750,000 Palestinians become refugees, the Nakba.
Absolutely pivotal, catastrophic year.
It sets the stage for everything that follows. The loss of land, the refugee crisis, these are the core issues still unresolved today.
The timeline then covers later events.
Yes, briefly touches on the ongoing occupation after the 1967 war, the first Intifada, the Palestinian uprising starting in '87 against the occupation, the second Intifada from 2000, Hamas taking control of Gaza in 2007, followed by the Israeli blockade, major conflicts like Operation Cast Lead in Gaza in 08-09, the tunnel networks, the 2014 Gaza war. It brings us closer to the present-day situation.
Got it. Now, the sources also briefly mention the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. We should clarify what that is.
Absolutely essential to clarify. The Protocols is a notorious forgery, a completely fabricated text claiming to reveal a Jewish plan for world domination. It's classic anti-Semitic propaganda, thoroughly debunked countless times, including by a U.S. Senate committee mentioned in the sources. It has zero basis in reality, but has fueled hatred for over a century.
Okay, important context. Finally, there were a couple of other threads, alternative ideas about ancient Israel's origins, and using fascism as an analytical lens.
Just briefly mentioned, yes. One is the Midianite or Kenite hypothesis, the idea that some early Israelite religious beliefs might have roots in neighboring tribes to the south. Another theory suggests early Israel emerged organically from local Canaanite pastoralists settling down in the hill country rather than solely through external conquest.
And the fascism point.
That came from a source explaining fascist ideology. Its typical elements like glorifying a mythical past, demonizing liberalism and equality, hating urban centers, idealizing rural life. The source presented these as analytical tools, potentially useful for understanding certain political movements or rhetoric in general, though it didn't explicitly apply them to the Israeli-Palestinian context in the material we reviewed.
Right, just presenting it as a framework.
Exactly.
Okay, that was a lot. We've covered a huge amount of ground looking at this conflict and its history from many different angles presented in the sources.
We really have. From the 1948 origins and the refugee question, the international view on a solution, the critiques of policies like demolitions or the wall, the role of lobby groups in the U.S., sensitive interpretations of religious texts, the historical timeline, anti-Semitic forgeries, even origins of ancient Israel and political theory.
And just to reiterate one last time, this exploration was based entirely on the documents provided. We haven't inserted our own views or gone beyond what those sources presented.
That's right. The goal was purely to unpack the information and perspectives contained within that material.
So as we wrap up, maybe a final thought for everyone listening. Given all these conflicting narratives, historical interpretations, and ongoing policies we've discussed from the sources, what are the real long-term challenges in finding a path towards a just and lasting peace? And perhaps, what responsibility do we all have as individuals to critically examine the stories we're told about the past and understand how they shape the present?
Heavy questions, but important ones to ponder.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.